Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and today I'm really excited about being able to bring you this particular episode because it's a conversation with a YouTuber whose content I have really grown to love over the last wee while, and someone I just recommend to people, and it's Jonathan Pageau of the Symbolic world. And Jonathan, I mean, not only is he a great iconographer and artist, but I love his mind and the way he thinks about issues. I find myself nodding in agreement on more occasions than I find myself disagreeing with him. And so for me, it was a real privilege and a pleasure when I reached out to him and asked, would he actually come on my channel and have a conversation about cinema and storytelling and symbolism and the bigger sort of picture and what it all means. And he agreed to do that. And as you'll see from the introduction of this video in just a moment, it actually took us a while, a lot longer than we thought, to actually get around to recording this for various outside and uncontrollable reasons. But without any further ado, I present to you my conversation with Jonathan Pageau of the Symbolic world. Well, Jonathan, thank you for being here with us today at last. This has been like a series of calamities that have really prevented this from happening until now. This was supposed to happen months ago, before Easter, in fact. First of all, the day we had originally scheduled to have this conversation, the fire at Notre Dame broke out, and that was huge. I mean, yeah, it was hugely impacting. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, how the heck are we going to have a conversation then? I get this message from you saying I can't have this conversation today. And I was like, well, that suits me fine. And then there was the flood. It's kind of like Elijah, right? Where is God? Is he in the flood? Is he in the fire? And then I confused the time zones a couple of weeks ago, and I had a public speaking engagement, and so we had to postpone yet again. But here we are today, ready to do this. So tell me, for those who are on my channel who might not be familiar with you, Jonathan, and your channel, The Symbolic World, what do you do? Tell us a little bit about yourself and why, I guess, in your line of work, symbolism matters. What do you do?
So, I mean, I would say primarily I'm an artist. I'm an icon carver, which means that I make Christian images within the language of ancient Christianity. So I'm Orthodox, and so that's kind of the world in which I take my patterns and my work. But in terms of YouTube, I'm mostly known for my channel, Symbolic World, where I do symbolic analyses of different things, cultural phenomena, movies, but mostly helping people to understand the Christian tradition and the patterns that are there and how they help us to live in the world. So that's mostly been the thing that I've been focusing on in the last 2 years. And like you said, in the past month or so, 2 months now, I've been kind of thrown into a bit of a chaos because I had a flood in my house and I've been evacuated, and that's why I have this bad camera, and I'm just kind of I know, and bad lighting, and I'm just trying to kind of get myself back into the groove of making videos.
So I was going to say, what's the symbolism in all of this bad camera and bad lighting, but we won't go there. Tell me, though, what is symbolism? Because, you know, your channel is The Symbolic World. Why does it matter so much? Because some people could be tempted to think, oh, is this some, you know, airy-fairy, new age, fluffy stuff, or is it some sort of weird conspiracy where he's seeing, you know, pentagrams in every tree? It's actually quite profound, isn't it? And very simple, right?
Right. Well, the way the word symbol means, it's a Greek word which means two things coming together, or two things being thrown together. And so the way that symbolism works, the way that we talk about symbolism, is that the world is made of too much detail. You know, you look at the world and we don't realize that, in fact, if I wanted to, I could focus on some little aspect of, like how your hair is moving. I could talk about that for 2 hours because there's millions of hairs moving, and so there's so much detail in the world. But the way that the human being exists in the world is that we do create syntheses. We tend to compress information into narrative, into image, into these structures that help us see meaning in the world. And that is what I talk about when I'm talking about symbolism. And it doesn't happen arbitrarily. It happens in patterns. And those patterns help us to understand how the world lays itself out, why, as human beings, we have things like stories, why we have things like, patterns in terms of how we qualify time, how we qualify space in terms of, how we have centers and peripheries. All of these things are what symbolism is made of. Basically, how we exist in the world is symbolic. So it's not, a lot of people, like you said, they tend to think when I talk about symbolism, especially when I'm talking about the Bible, they'll say, oh, you're saying it's just symbolic. It's just, let's say, a metaphor for something. And that's not at all what we're talking about. When I talk about symbolism, it's this notion of how things come together. And so stories are a part of how things come together, but your experience as well. Because you don't experience all the possible things you could experience in reality. You synthesize them into a coherent, meaningful pattern.
Speaking of experiential stuff, I guess coming up from that sort of perhaps personalist level, where you start with that human experience thing and sort of perhaps work your way up. I want to talk a little bit about the transformative power of symbolism, because it's not just what we see, right? It's the influence that and the way that shapes us. So an example I like to use with people is my wife and I, on the day we got married, when we said our wedding vows, we held a crucifix between us and our hands to symbolically show everyone gathered what we were doing. It wasn't just saying I do, it was I'm saying yes to getting on the cross with and for you. That's what our marriage was about. And then when we got married, that crucifix became our marriage crucifix. It hangs in our room. And then a couple of years ago, we did a renovation, and I got a photograph of every one of our 5 children just in the moments after they were born and hung it around the outside of that crucifix. So every morning, we get up and we see this reminder of this call to self-sacrificial love that is our marriage, and we see a reminder that love has been fruitful as well.
Yeah.
And so that's a transformative thing, right? I'm impacted by that when I see that every day. So it goes the other way too, right?
Yeah. And I think that the example you're using is a great example of what symbolism is, because what you're doing is you're taking the thing that's most important to you, let's say your faith, and the cross itself, which is actually this meeting of heaven and earth. The cross as a symbol is a place where the vertical meets the horizontal. So it is a place of joining. And so you put that in the middle of both of you, and it so you're pointing to the center of your faith, but also what it is that's going to be the thing that's going to hold your marriage together, which is your faith. And then it becomes the center of your family. So this notion that I talked about how things come together, you've done that very well, and then it becomes a reminder. And memory is very important in symbolism, because, how can I say this? Everything has a form of memory, because everything has a form of distance from its identity, and so, or you could call it multiplicity. And so, a community is a multiple amount of people, but they always have to remember what it is that brings them together. And when they forget that, then they start to fragment. And so this notion of creating this moment of remembrance in the morning, where you get up and you see the crucifix and you remember what is the center of your family, what is the center of your marriage, and that's exactly what it is. It's not an arbitrary metaphor. It's everything coming together. Like you said, it's a very powerful way for people to understand what symbolism can be.
It seems to me, though, today, one of the things that I think we're sort of, what would you call it? Perhaps in your terms, we are symbolic poor, or symbolism poor. And we have a poverty of sorts in this area now because of the materialism that so pervades everything, our thoughts and the way we think about the world and the person and our interaction with the world. And it seems to me that a big part of symbolism is the sense of mystery and wonder, and symbolism sort of intimately and inextricably sort of linked with all of that sort of stuff. Do you think that modern tendency towards things like materialism, empiricism would be another one, scientism, and then utilitarianism that results from it, that desire to sort of reduce everything to its material components, the reductionist view, do you think that harms our ability to understand and to sort of live a full and flourishing life with symbolism present around us?
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And what I would do is I would push your idea even further and show the other extreme, which is happening at the same time, which is that on the one hand, we have this deep materialist, almost nihilistic culture of quantities, of economic exchange, all of this, of kind of individualism in the negative sense. And at the same time, our culture is full of this fantastical imagery, Harry Potter, Marvel, Star Wars, all of these things. And so what we've done actually, and what you'll find, which is fascinating, is that the people who are interested in Star Wars or those types of stories can often be the same materialist type of person that would deny religious symbolism or would deny religious narrative. And so what you're seeing is a kind of a wrenching apart of aspects of us. It is an anti-symbolic move in their life. So they want to attach meaning to these fantastical stories, which they can't live in. They can't integrate those stories. And then they want to remove meaning from everyday life, from the way that the world lays itself out. Whereas Christianity and religion in general, what it offers is a union of all of that. That is, we live in, as Christians, we live in the story of Christianity. We are a continuation of the story of Christ. We are joined to that story. And so our symbolism, our patterns, these stories that we're involved in are not just fantastical and in our imagination. So they can give us the same kind of satisfaction that people will get from seeing a mythological pattern in a Star Wars story, but we can actually live in them. Like the best that the other types of people can do is cosplay and dressing up as Darth Vader, and and it doesn't do anything. It's not a really profound transformative experience.
I was presenting at a conference on the weekend, and one of the things I was talking about is the loss of community in the West and how that's really harming us. And I think the big reason why is we have lost our unifying symbolism, the transcendent reality of Christianity, which shaped us and which was the symbolism we lived in and understood. Now, once that's gone, we're all in our sort of relativistic ideological silos. And I think that's why we struggle to tell good stories today as much as we used to, because we're not in touch with a big overarching story. I would say the truth. But we've lost touch with that. And that has a profound impact on our ability to tell good stories, right?
No, I totally agree. I think it's interesting because at the same time, there's a proliferation of storytelling. I mean, we've never seen as many stories today as we in the history of the universe. I mean, how many bad novels are published every year? How many TV shows exist? We're actually drowning in storytelling. And it's a very deep desire which is manifesting itself, and a strange desire to connect to storytelling. But because it's done in such a superficial and kind of like a consuming way, where it's like we consume stories like we consume popcorn, like we consume anything. It's seen as just a form of it's like it really is like drinking soda. Like these stories are like taking drugs or whatever. It's just getting some kind of very short pleasure from something. Whereas the deep stories, the ancient stories, like I said, they're participative. They're very different. They order time. They order space. They create festivals. They create things in which we celebrate. We just celebrated in the Orthodox Church. We just celebrated Pentecost, and then before that we celebrated the Ascension. Then we celebrated Pascha, and so we have these stories. They end up marking time, and now we're running out of things to mark time. For example, every day is the same. Night and day is becoming the same. In America, they have stores that are open 24 hours a day. That there's nothing to create a pattern in time. It's just this. Yeah, everything is being spread out equally in a kind of nihilistic way.
And by the way, on a side note, I often say to Christians whenever I'm presenting to them that I think that liturgical calendar is so essential for us, because it's a way in which we can be in the world but not of the world. I'm a person of the resurrection, so I celebrate the resurrection. I'm a person of Pentecost, I celebrate it. Like in our family, that's a big deal, and that's the time, if you like, that sets our time, and even though we live in that other time as well, and it gives a routine and a rhythm to who we are, and it's a touchstone to our own culture and identity, I think, too, as well.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a relationship between time markers, it's a identity of time and identity of person, and that's something that people don't tend to understand, but you can understand it in the sense that I celebrate your birthday, in the sense that we celebrate the New Year, or that we still have some celebrations left, not a lot, but we'll celebrate, let's say, a national holiday. In Quebec we have St. John the Baptist Day, which is our national holiday. So we can see how this marking of time is related to also marking of our own identities, and that's something people tend to forget.
Let's move on to the world of cinema. Why is symbolism so potent for cinema? We've already talked about the idea of if we're not in touch with the big story, the little stories are going to suffer, because I think the little stories are always pointing us back to the big story in some way. But why would symbolism, or at least can it be so potent for cinema? And funnily enough, I watched a video of a presentation you gave recently where you were talking about how cinema and the sort of the idea of Wagner is almost like this complete form of symbolism because of all of the various sound, this picture, this everything goes into it. But why would symbolism be so important in that particular realm?
One of the things also that we all need to remember when we're talking about symbolism, we're actually talking about the patterns of reality, where it's not arbitrary, and that's something that's kind of difficult sometimes for people to understand. You know, the story of the fall and the fall leading to the resurrection, that kind of story it's the way that we actually perceive the world. It's maybe difficult for me to lay it out completely when I'm talking now, but when you create a story, if you want to make a movie, especially movies, because movies are so expensive to make, they have to reach out to the largest audience possible. And so the very fact that movie makers are just trying to make money, people think that's bad, but I mean, the fact that they're actually trying to get a lot of people in and to make money means that they have to participate in some patterns which are real. They have to allude to things which everybody will recognize and therefore is part of a universal pattern. And so because of that, what ends up happening is that sometimes in the most superficial Hollywood blockbuster movie, you will find some of the most accurate and profound symbols. It doesn't mean there's not a lot of silliness, not a lot of nonsense in the story, but once in a while you can grab something in a very popular movie and show how that pattern is there's a reason why it's there and why it touches people so much. It's because it's a pattern of reality. Your own being is patterned after that story. Not the story itself, but the pattern behind it, you could say.
It's interesting when we think about cinema. I want to talk about Star Wars in particular. I'm a Star Wars fan from back in the day. A lot of people on my channel are here because I've got commentary about that. And I think you look at George Lucas, and he very much was steeped in Joseph Campbell and the Jungian archetypes. And the whole idea of symbolism is very, very prescient in that original trilogy, even in the prequels. Then we get the new trilogy. George Lucas is gone. And we now have people who, in my sense or my estimation, are mimicking what they see but don't perhaps understand the depth of what Lucas was doing. How do you feel as someone looking at the old trilogy, the old former Star Wars films versus the new trilogy? How do you think symbolism, what does it look like? Is it good? Is it bad? What's happening there?
I think there's a lot of things wrong with the Star Wars trilogy. I mean, this new Star Wars trilogy. The first thing that was off about it is the fact that they had several people in charge of different movies, and so they didn't actually think of a coherent arc all through. They were just kind of handing it to each other. So that's a problematic. The second problem is this theme that we've seen in movies and in culture, pop up more and more, which is this desire to replace masculine characteristics with female characters, and so to embody masculine characteristics with a female character, and then to use that as a way to actually denigrate male characters. And so because of that, what ends up happening is that although even in the first of the Star Wars trilogy, there were some interesting possible things there was some interesting things which were being set up, but you kept being reminded of the political agenda of the movie. And so when that happens, it pulls you away. When a movie is only about political agenda, it ends up being propaganda. And we saw it happen way more in the second movie. I mean, so much of it was propaganda that it was, I went to the second movie seriously. I went in with every good intention in the world. I was like, I'm going to let myself get taken into the story, but I kept getting pulled out, by Rose Tico and all these characters that were there just to kind of give you a message, to preach to you, or to and the John Boyega character, what's his name? Finn,
yeah.
That character is unbearable. Like he's just there to take beatings from female characters. Like that's his whole role is just to be beaten up by a female, to be a foil to a female character. So I think that to me has been the problem. And the second movie, especially the director, you could see that he was a subversive person who wanted to subvert narrative, to subvert expectations. He didn't have the type of reverence towards the story that usually will create mythical stories. He had a very irreverent attitude, and that showed in the movie. And I think that's why the Star Wars trilogy is a little bit in trouble.
I think you see, particularly in that second film, in The Last Jedi, you see very much an emphasis on technique. So the engineering is almost perfect. The imagery and the visuals are some of the most beautiful you'll see in a Star Wars film. But the real heart is missing, right? The symbolism, the mythology is not there.
Yeah, that whole arc where they go to the casino and free the horses or whatever, free those animals. My goodness, I mean, it was unbearable. It had nothing to do with the story. It was just there to give you some strange moralism about the rich and imprisoning animals, and it was just it was unbearable. I mean, even my children, my children who are not very political, they really didn't feel as excited about it. They were excited about some scenes, the fight scene. That some of the fight scenes were really impressive, like you said. Some of the visuals were really impressive, but I think that's why a lot of people didn't want to go see Solo, because they just were. Even the people who didn't see it consciously, who just unconsciously had this bad taste, this little bit of a bad taste in their mouth. They were just like, I'll watch Solo when it comes out on. When it streams. I won't go to the theater.
It seems to me this is an example too of where politics is now usurping symbolism and storytelling. It's just inserting propaganda into using a movie instead of to tell a story, to actually almost pretty much like every authoritarian regime has done, to try and enforce dogma upon people.
Yeah, what it does is it creates very thin storytelling. It creates very thin characters. And it's not going to last long. It's not going to have a long lasting effect on people. People are not going to remember these movies. I always tell people that if you read honestly the Bible and you look at the characters in the Bible, those characters, although they're written with such simplicity, with such economy of means, we don't get a lot of details about the characters, but in that economy of means, there is an extreme complexity. Every single character in the Old Testament has a dark side, which you can do it. Like, it's actually can be interesting to do so, to go through all the characters and show the strangeness or the dark side of each character, because we tend to want to glaze over that. But no, the characters in the Bible are extremely rich and complex, and I think that's something that people they forget, or they gloss over, because they want to portray a very kind of, let's say, a nice version of religion, but the profundity is in there, and the profundity in the story of Christ is there too. I always tell people, I wrote an article last year called "The Judge and the Victim," and in that article, I tried to contrast and show, to pull to the extreme and contrast all the imagery of Christ as the king, as the judge, as someone who brings fire, as this kind of harsh, really, really judgmental figure, and then also this figure of the one who forgives, who cares, who then is also punished without an innocent victim of a cruel system. And so trying to show those two extremes, to pull those two, to say Christ is not one or the other, and you won't find a political version of Christ that will satisfy your political needs, because as soon as you show Christ, rebuking someone, then you see him hanging out with publicans and also saying that we should give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and so it's like you every time you try to put him in a box where he fits, he's going to bust that box open. There's no way around it.
You're so right about the potency of so many of the stories and the persons we read about in the scriptures, because if you say to someone, well, that guy's a real Judas, they know straight away what you mean, that they connect with, and it's around the vice, right? Or someone says, well, that was a Lazarus moment that I had, that you know what they're talking about, right? That's how potent. But some of it's so simple. It's not a large and fleshed out tome about a person. But it's all there, right? And the reality of it.
Yeah, and in the first stories, especially when you read the stories in Genesis, those stories are so densely compacted. Every sentence, every word is so full of meaning that you can spend your entire life just meditating. And I keep coming back to the story in Genesis, to the fall, story of the fall, and coming back from it from all the angles, and you're never done getting through it, because it just keeps revealing itself to you.
Yeah, there's such a richness, right, in that preternatural world, and there's so much more than just what you might think. Like, if you're coming from an outside perspective, you might just think, oh, that's a lovely story about the beginnings. But in actual fact, it's about who we are as persons, what happens to us as a result of that darkness that enters the world. It's really quite profound. Even human sexuality, marriage, it's all wrapped up in there.
It's all wrapped up in there. Yeah, and like you said, it's not just about something that happened long ago. It's an image of who we are now, and it's an image of reality, and how we encounter our let's say, our margins, how we encounter the thing we're pointing to towards the garden. All of these things are bound up in this story. Yeah.
Tell me, we were supposed to record this a few days before Easter, and so I had a question to talk about. So, but let's talk about it anyway. Easter was only a few weeks ago. If you're Orthodox, it's closer than the rest of us who are non-Orthodox. But tell me, Passiontide and Easter, and the symbolism of that in cinema, because I think this is one of the big symbolic moments that's in all of the great films in particular, is the symbolism of Eastertide and Passiontide is very much present in cinema. What are two of your favourite cinematic depictions that you can think of self-sacrificial love or of martyrdom, which is a big part of that Easter symbolism?
Well, it's very difficult for me to think of a favorite. It's so funny because I'm not that attached to movies as much. I do movie interpretations on my channel, but I always tend to see them as a way to then point to the bigger story. And so I'm not a fan of these movies. It's hard for people to yeah. I struggle to explain that to people, but really I'm not. But what I would say is that in that case, I would maybe point to the larger pattern, which is if you look at the ancient hero, if you look at the Greek hero, if you look at the Roman hero, the hero, especially the Greek hero, the Greek hero was there to just, let's say, glorify himself. He was there to accumulate glory to himself. And the idea that he would fight a war was not to sacrifice himself, but rather to just show his strength, show his prowess, and protect his interest. All of that was part of the Greek, let's say, the Greek vision of the hero. And if you look at the heroes in Greek mythology, some of them are rather somber because it's not about morality at all. Some of them are actually quite immoral, like Hercules is a rather immoral character and a lot of the myths. But what happens with Christianity and the arrival of Christianity is we really do get the idea that the hero, that the main character, the value that he has is in his capacity to, in his strength, to sacrifice himself for someone who cannot do it, who cannot defend themselves. And so it is in a manner the knightly ideal, the ideal of the knight, which is very, very Christian, despite what people want to think, because the knight is someone who puts his strength and his prowess in service to those who cannot defend themselves. And so this notion that someone would die helping a weaker party, and that would somehow give them value, is an extremely is a Christian story. That's right. And so no matter what, all these modern stories, as they are trying to destroy the Christian narrative, as they are trying to be to undermine Christianity, that pattern is something that they really struggle to get rid of, because it is one of the most profound patterns of the West, and we have it. It's there underlying all our stories. So when you watch a movie of some hero who does everything and sacrifices himself for someone else, then you're seeing that story of Christ. And if you see it, especially the movie where you see him do that and then fall and die or almost die, and then at the very, very end, finally, despite all that, finally get up, it's like you're seeing the story of the resurrection. It's constantly there. In so many movies, you see someone, he doesn't have to die, but he's unconscious. You don't know, is he dead? Is he alive? And then finally he gets up, and they did that in sacrifice for someone else. That is the Christian story. And, we have to understand that as we get rid of the Christian story, ultimately at some point we're going to get rid of that. And when we do, people don't know what's on the other side. They don't understand the cruelty and the coldness of the pagan world. I have a lot of people, even who watch my videos, who are kind of neo-pagans, people who are wanting to renew Odinic religion and this kind of northern religion. But, until the Normans became knights and became Christian, they were just raping and cutting people's heads off. Yeah. Like they did not at all have the ideal that created, the kings of England and that kind of knightly characteristics. And so when we're looking over that hill as we deconstruct his Christianity, it's not a pretty picture.
And that's something interesting enough that it fascinates me as well, and that concerns me too, is that even the tendency of the new paganism. I remember reading an essay some time ago that was written in the 30s, I think, called The New Paganism. And the author talked about the real concern about the new paganism was the fact that you would have technology married up with like a relativistic approach, and you end up with basically human dignity as the sacrifice that is sacrificed on that altar. And I would say you can see that playing out in the 20th century very, very clearly, right?
Yeah. And even recently, like I was saying 20 years ago, that as Christianity loses its grip and as a kind of neo-pagan vision of the world appears, what we're going to see is infanticide and also the elder being killed off, because that was a lot of the practices in paganism was exposing children who were not fit, and also expecting the elderly to kind of dispatch themselves because their value was finished, like their value for the community was over. And so I think that that's something that we're seeing with euthanasia and abortion getting stronger and stronger, and it's going to get worse, and it's going to get weirder and weirder, because especially this whole idea of organ harvesting and all this weird stuff that's coming on the horizon. Like I said, as Christianity disappears, why not? Why wouldn't you use the organs of the sick or the people who are dying to feed the healthy? That's the type of human sacrifice which was part of paganism. Because that's what it was. And if you think you're going to get to especially northern paganism without that type of attitude, I don't think it's possible.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, and you think about something like the Netherlands now, where there's a discussion happening about this idea of we should legalize organ donation as a form of euthanasia. So you go in there alive, and they end your life by literally removing all of your organs that they couldn't normally take, and then and you would die in the process. And it is very much now being touted as very pagan idea of you making a sacrifice, for the good harvest outcome or whatever it might be back in the day. It's frightening stuff. I mean,
it is frightening.
I think in terms of movies, for me, I think that whole idea of self-gift, which is very fundamental to Easter. Recent example, I think, was just really hit the nail on the head. They're so rare these days, but was the film Calvary, where Brendan Gleeson plays an Irish priest, and it starts with him in a confessional, and a stranger walks in behind the other side of the confessional and says, "I was the victim of sexual abuse by a priest," and he says, "I know you are a good man and you're innocent, but I'm coming back in 3 days and I'm going to kill you." And 7 days it might be. And the whole movie is about leading up to this moment of him having to make the sacrifice, this good man. And it's so profound and deep the way it explores those themes. The theme of resurrection, do you have any, is there any movies that you think sort of get that right or that stand out for you around resurrection?
It's funny because I actually like to show I tend to like to show the more vulgar, not vulgar in terms of, but the more kind of common visions. Like, you'll see Rocky get beaten up, and then he falls to the ground, and then finally he gets up. All these images are all images that are pointing to the resurrection. That they're not necessarily, they don't contain the whole story, but they're all kind of pointing to that moment. So I'm sadly I don't have like one example that I think is amazing, but I think that it's there. It's pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of like that, isn't it? And it's hard to sort of put your finger on what's the one that stands out.
Well, here's an example that people might not have thought of. I made a video about this. There's a movie called Gravity about these people in space, that this astronaut who gets caught in space and she can't get out and everything. And so she's in this world of death. And when she comes back to Earth, like the director makes her go into the water.
Yeah.
So right. Her spaceship actually lands into the water, and all during the whole movie, you realize that she's kind of floating around. And so it's like space is water, so space is death. Space is also, in the baptism symbolism. So she goes down into the water, and then she comes back out, and she stands up, and that's how the movie ends.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my goodness. And if you ask the director, he didn't even realize that he had made this as an allusion to the resurrection, because it's so profoundly ingrained in his way of thinking that it just makes sense to have someone go into water, come back out, and then stand up. It's baptism, it's resurrection, it's all that. But it also makes total sense to us. We don't question it, even though it's strange. But we don't question it.
Yeah, another great example of that, I think, is in the Shawshank Redemption, when Andy Dufresne crawls through all of that sewage and he comes out the other side and stands in a cruciform position and is washed clean by the rain. And it's so baptismal that you're passing from life to death. He's freed from his prison and he's washed clean. It's quite profound, you know. A great example for me of resurrection in recent films was The Dark Knight Rises. It's obviously got it in the title, but that when he's put down into that prison, and he's sent into that prison, he goes down into Sheol, the world of the dead. He preaches to the souls that are there who are stuck, and then he finally, under his own power, he climbs that wall and escapes. And there's a little moment as he climbs over the other side of this pit, he drops down the rope behind him so that everyone else who's trapped down there has that sort of path to freedom. They can use the rope now to climb up. Do you think that symbolism in modern, I originally was thinking about superhero movies, but I guess just in movies in general, is in danger of being corrupted by postmodernism? I think particularly of sort of the Nietzschean idea of the Übermensch, the strong man. And it seems to me that we're almost stuck between this will to power of Friedrich Nietzsche, the strong man, the Übermensch, and the Freudian will to pleasure, happiness, personal happiness, self-gratification. And those things, do you see that as a danger to symbolism and storytelling and stuff, that it almost like symbolism becomes a form of propaganda?
No, I agree. I agree that, especially, as you said, especially in the superhero movies, it's a bit dangerous because the superhero movies have been trying to explicitly use Christian symbolism. Even there are some movies where they'll send packets to pastors, and give them preaching notes so that they know how to preach from their movies, and so, but it is a little dangerous because, the Christ conquering death had to do with giving in to death as well. And so that's something that is very difficult for us to. You see movies where they do that. There are several movies where they're able to do that, where the weakness of the character becomes his strength, or where it's a surprise where the person, like you said, instead of fighting the enemy, sacrifices themselves, and then that somehow flips and turns into the solution for the story. So you see that as well, but there is a danger to confuse the kind of superhero which comes down and beats down bad guys and the Christian story, which is not the same. Another of the big problems that we're seeing is that the people who have mastered symbolism in since the 60s have really been the postmodern feminist types. And so because of that, they've been able to tell the most convincing stories, but they've been able to twist them and kind of flip them upside down. I always give the example of Shrek as the ultimate example of a upside down fairy tale, where it has the whole pattern of the fairy tale, but in the end, the princess becomes an ogre, right? The ogre doesn't become a prince. And so you see a lot of those upside down fairy tales. And sadly, what we're seeing in some of these movies is a very strange twist on the notion of sacrifice, which is that a lot of these stories are presenting the self-sacrifice of the person. It's usually like a male character, a strong male character who sacrifices himself in order to give his place to some, like a woman or to some other character. And so that becomes a very weird type of symbolism. And so the king who moves aside and lets his daughter take the throne. I saw the movie Aladdin recently, and I was really surprised because in the original Aladdin, that's not part of the tropes. But in that movie, there's a whole scene that's added, which is the king tells his daughter that she should be the next king, basically. And so it's her; she's the one who's going to be the next ruler. You see that in Moana. You see that in so many movies, even in the Logan movie, which on so many levels I thought was amazing. You see him being replaced by. His clone is a woman, and he's being replaced by a woman. And so we have to be, at the same time, we have to be attentive at these stories and be able to see sometimes how devious they can be. This idea of using the male desire to sacrifice himself for the weaker, but to use that politically to then justify some kind of usurpation is very disturbing. It's very, very disturbing. So we definitely have to be attentive to that.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that very line, "Let the past die," is part of the new Star Wars trilogy, and it's very clearly spelled out. And
Yeah,
it's
the future is female.
yeah, yeah.
That's what they say.
Yeah, and then it's that there's that whole sense of, no, you must die now and get out of our way. And I think it's also interesting, the inversion of wisdom and youth. Now it's like, no, young people are everything. Old people are, they're it's no longer about wisdom. They're in the way. They're an impediment, right?
In The Last Jedi, there's that horrible, monstrous scene where Rey finds herself in the cave where she's kind of supposed to encounter her dark side, supposed to face her, face her sins or whatever. And then all she sees is this infinite, like, causality of herself.
Yeah, that's right.
And so she just sees this kind of infinite causality of herself, and it's like, that's it. That's the millennial insanity. That's the modern insanity of let the past die and not being connected, feeling like novelty somehow has value in itself. That stuff is very dangerous and very disturbing.
Let's finish now by just talking about this, because I think we've alluded to this. We've had a little brief chat about it, but there is very real danger now for the West, right? Because of this loss of symbolism. Even Nietzsche, who declares the death of God, is worried about what that means. I mean, he's got bad ideas to how he thinks he can replace it, but he's worried. And it seems to me that today, a lot of people don't realize just how fundamental that unifying symbolism was, and not just for connecting us in community, but also for giving us a sense of purpose and our morality, all the moral intuitions that we take for granted.
That's right.
So what happens from here? If you were a betting man, I mean, you can't be in these situations, but as much as you can be, what do you think things might progress like as far as this sort of breakdown goes?
The way that I see it is a way that maybe might surprise people, is that I think that this is part of the story. I think that part of the Christian story has always been the breakdown of Christianity. I think that part of the story of Christianity has always been the possible, or let's say the coming death of faith. What Christ says, when I return, will I find faith in the world? And you see that in so many places where this idea that it's going to get worse, right? It's going to get worse, it's going to get bad. And so I think that we shouldn't be surprised to watch Christianity break down. We shouldn't act as if this is unprecedented, because atheism comes out of Christianity. Atheism is a bastard child of Christianity. Atheism is the Judas that came out of the 12 disciples. It is Christ chose his own betrayer, and Christianity also gave birth to its own betrayal. And I think that that's somehow part of the story. And so we have to just play the story out. And I think that we have to play out the story in the right way. We have to Christ said that there will be scandal, but woe to those by whom the scandal comes. And so we have to not be surprised at the scandal, but we have to try to be the just in that scandal. We have to try to be those that remain true to Christ's message, to the vocation of the Christian within that story. So I think that it's not going to get better. There's no way it's going to get better. But what we'll see, I think, as it gets worse, is we're going to see little moments of people coming together. We're going to see some saints come out of this process, and hopefully there'll be enough of that to carry us through, the dark time. But to be honest, I don't see a social solution to this, and I've been telling this forever to people. I think the solution to the breakdown of Western culture and the breakdown of Christianity is you become a saint. You become like Christ. That's the only solution. And if you do that, then you will gather around you enough meaning and enough purpose to carry some people with you as well.
Yeah, well, it's like that famous letter that G.K. Chesterton is purported to have written to the editor of his local paper, when the editor decried what was wrong with the world and the collapse of the world, and G.K. Chesterton wrote back famously and said, "Dear sir, you've asked what's wrong with the world. I am yours sincerely, G.K. Chesterton." And so much we're looking for the big solution out here, and right. It's an excuse not to actually begin to live virtue in here, right?
That's right, yeah. And it's so much easier to look at the world outside and to see how horrible it is, and because it is, and that's the problem. But it's a way. It's also can be a way to justify ourselves and to make us feel like that if only the world could adapt itself to me, then then it would all be good. I don't know if you saw the recent Nike ad, recent Nike ads, which said, "Don't change yourself, change the world."
That's right. Yeah.
My goodness. I mean, that is the epitome of evil.
Yeah.
That is Eve reaching up for the apple right there.
That's right.
That is it's the beginning of the fall.
Yeah, it is the ultimate autonomous self-choosing individual. I will remake the world in my own image.
In my own image, exactly.
And it's your view of history. I find myself in agreement with. I don't think it's strange at all. It's very Tolkien-esque. The whole idea of the long defeat of history that Tolkien held about that view of the world. And I think too, it's funny because that's where Christianity was. Traditionally for Christianity, when we used to talk about the end times, we understood that the end times began the moment Christ was born. It's not some far off future thing. And then we got caught up with the idea of heaven on earth, and we'd build utopia here. And I think we lost sight of that I think so much of that long defeat is really about where we are allowed this privilege of being able to strip away so much of the unnecessary to become more like Christ, who is everything is stripped from him on the cross,
But one of the things I think that an interesting way though to understand it is to understand it in the parable of the wheat and the tares. Is that's something that a friend of mine has kind of brought me to see, is that what we're seeing happen around us is a raising up of the wheat and the tares. And so on the one hand, we live in a society where there are barely any, let's say around us, close by, we take care of the poor, we take care of the needy, and so and we have a desire to take care of the poor and the needy. We have a desire to take care of the marginalized. All that is part of our society. And so we have positive aspects, but then we also have this whole decadent, very perverse aspect of our culture, which is also growing up at the same time. So I think that we have to be able to see those kind of. It's hard to do that, but I think it's important to do that. That we see some great good happening and some great evil, and that that the end of that will be the separating of the both. But for now, we kind of have to make way for the both. And in some ways, I think that maybe we're seeing a lot more tares right now. That's possible, especially because we're very comfortable. So it's easier to see the tares as well. But in order to not go insane, I think it's important to be able to see both at the same time.
And just and my final statement on that would be, if you want to make your way through this and survive it, then what you need to do is make yourself uncomfortable and form meaningful community with people, and build it around that symbolism. And I would say, as a Christian, build it around the truth and the symbolism of that. And it's uncomfortable to be in community, but it's only through that you will find your, I think, flourishing in a world of hedonistic individualism and autonomy. You actually, it's through community and self-giving that you find yourself.
Yeah, and it's very practical. And sometimes I tell people, I like, okay, there's this transcendent image, there's this metaphysical image of what the church is and why it exists and how it is. But there's also a very practical thing, which is, and we can see what happens when it breaks down, is that right now we form communities with people who are like us, with people who have the same interests as us. Online, we end up creating these silos of interest. Whereas the church, when you actually go to a building and everybody's actually focused on a transcendent thing, focus on the incarnation, focus on Christ, then you have all this difference that's also there, united in Christ. So you have to deal with the annoying person. You have to deal with the person who thinks too much of themselves, the person who is needy, the person who's passive aggressive, and realize that you're also one of those in that whole dynamic. Something which is more difficult when we just want to be with people that will make us feel good, and so I think that in a very practical way, what you said is true.
Jonathan, thank you so much for being here today. It was such an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed it. Tell me, for my regular YouTube watchers, first of all, is there a book or books that you would recommend if they want to delve more deeply into some of this, the whole idea of symbolism? Is there anything that you've found helpful for you in shaping your understanding in these areas?
Yeah, I would say for people who are interested in symbolic patterns in a way that relates to scripture and how it relates to the rest of the world, let's say, my brother, Mathieu Pageau, has written a book called The Language of Creation, which goes very deeply into that and into Genesis and tries to show you the pattern in Genesis. That is definitely something worth reading. And if not in Christianity itself, I always tell people, read St. Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses, read St. Ephrem the Syrian's The Hymns on Paradise. Those books will open your eyes to the possibility of Scripture and how it describes your life and describes the entire cosmos. And so those are the books that I tend to recommend. If not, people can check out my own YouTube channel, Jonathan Pageau, The Symbolic World. I have it on podcast as well, and my website, thesymbolicworld.com. You'll find everything you need from on my own end there.
Yeah, I was about to say, and let's not forget your channel. How do people track you down? Are you on any other social media that people can follow you and sort of hear your thoughts on the world?
So I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. To be honest, I tried to be as little as possible, especially Twitter. Man, that's cancer. I felt sometimes I've just felt myself get sucked in, And so, but I do try to post. I post at least my videos and I react to some comments. Once in a while, I'll post other stuff. If you want to follow my art as well, I post it on social media. So that's a positive thing, is I post pictures of my carvings and the process on Facebook and Twitter. So
yeah, and can I say, I having seen some of that, just brief glimpses of it, Jonathan, your iconography and the artwork is just beautiful, and I know this is a big thing in our house. Like on the day my wife and I got married, I got her a surprise gift of Rublev's icon of the Trinity, and it was a big one that's framed and it hangs in our lounge. And this whole idea of community, and I love that icon. How it's perfectly circular, and you're the sort of the missing guest at the bottom of the table there, and so your iconography is just glorious. And if you want to see some good, beautiful art, it's well worth checking out Jonathan's channels for that alone.
Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
No worries. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. It was great to have you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed the conversation that I had with Jonathan. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please consider financially supporting the channel. The links for how to do that are found in the video description below. See you next time on Left Foot Media. Thanks for watching.